You are waking up in the middle of the night without knowing why. It is not a nightmare. It is not a noise. It is an objectless state of alert, a chill down the spine that has no identifiable cause, a sensation that something very important is happening on a plane that you cannot see, but can definitely feel. You lie there staring at the ceiling, your heart at a strange frequency, and your mind begins to parade all the reasons why your life has not yet reached where it should have. The bills, the plans that did not work out, the people who disappeared, the doors that did not open. And then, in the silence of those hours, you begin to wonder if perhaps the promise was not real, if perhaps you misunderstood, if perhaps God changed his mind. I need you to listen to what I am going to say now with all the attention you have available. This state you are describing is not common stress. It is not insomnia from excess caffeine. It is not clinical anxiety due to professional pressure. This specific state you feel, this involuntary vigil, this weight that has no name and this cold that has no source, is your spirit reacting to a movement that happened in a sphere that is completely beyond your physical senses, but is more real than anything you can touch or see. There is a court, and in that court a decision has been made in your favor. But the enemy does not want you to know this, because if you knew the verdict, you would stop acting like a defendant, and a man who knows he has been exonerated can no longer be controlled by the fear of condemnation. Stay with me until the end of this video, because what you will understand here is not abstract theology. It is the key for you to stop living as someone who is still awaiting judgment when the judgment has already ended, has already been proffered, and has already been sealed in your favor. If you are not yet subscribed to this channel, do it now, because we do not work with surface content here. We go deep where most do not go. Subscribe and activate the bell. Let us begin with the most important thing. The celestial court is not a metaphor. There is a scene in one of the oldest books of human literature that describes with cinematic precision what happens when the adversary raises an accusation against someone who belongs to God. The book is Job. And the scene is disconcerting in its clarity because it happens before anything that Job experiences on earth. Before the loss of his children, before the oxen and the donkeys, before the sores, before any touch of suffering in Job's earthly life, there is a scene in the celestial court. The sons of God present themselves before the Lord, and among them the text says that the adversary also came. Satan, in Hebrew, is not primarily a proper name. It is a title. Satan means the accuser, the prosecutor, the one who raises an accusation. And what he does in this scene is not attack Job with a spear. He questions Job's internal frequency. He says, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands, so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." The accusation was not about Job's external behavior. It was about the quality of his faith. The accuser was saying, his devotion is transactional. He serves God because God gives him a financial return. Remove the prosperity, and you will see who Job really is inside. He is operating on the frequency of fear disguised as faith. And God, instead of protesting and closing the matter with immediate authority, did something that seems disturbing to any superficial reading. He allowed the process. He said to the accuser, "Very well then, everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger." Why? Why did God allow the accusation to generate a process instead of simply discarding it? Because what was being tested was not just Job. It was the quality of Job's frequency. And that quality could not be demonstrated while prosperity was present. It could only be demonstrated in its absence. What Job went through was not punishment. It was verification. It was the process that would prove in a public and definitive way in the celestial court that the accusation was false, that Job's faith was not transactional, that his internal frequency was not anchored in the prosperity he had, but in something much deeper and much more solid than any bank account or inventory of goods. And when the process ended, when the verification was complete, the text records something that is the most important word of this entire video, God Zakariob. Like this video now if you feel you have gone through a process similar to Job's, where the drought you lived through did not seem like a test of obedience, but a verification of frequency. Because what comes after the Zakar will change the way you read your next steps. Zakar. This is the Hebrew word you need to engrave in your memory today. The most common translation is to remember, but this translation is so insufficient that it almost makes the word lose all the weight it carries. In Hebrew, Zakar is not a passive process of retrieving information from memory, like when you remember where you put your keys. Zakar is an active, intentional act, charged with consequences. When God does Zakar of someone, the text always records what happens next. God visited Sarah. God remembered Rachel. God heard the groaning of the people in Egypt and remembered the covenant. In all these cases, God's Zakar is not just the awareness that someone exists. It is the beginning of an active intervention that will change that person's reality irreversibly. Zakar is the moment when God turns his full attention to you and says, "Now is the time." And what precedes the Zakar? The process, the verification, the season that seemed like abandonment but was preparation for the moment when divine attention would turn to you in a way that no previous circumstance could have sustained. Job lost everything: children, property, health. The friends who should have comforted him arrived and spent days saying things that the text will later condemn as incorrect. His wife reached the point of saying, "Curse God and die." Job was in the lowest place any human being can reach, without goods, without health, without children, without friends who understood what was happening, and with the accusation still apparently pending in court. And then the text says that God turned to Job, Zakar. And in one of the most dramatic reversals in all of sacred literature, the Lord restored Job's fortunes when he prayed for his friends. And the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Not the same. Double. The process was not a net loss, it was a transfer. What left through the accusation returned multiplied by the verdict. Now I need to ask you a direct question. Can you identify in your own life the moment when the accusation was raised against you? Not necessarily in a visible spiritual way, but the moment when everything seemed to crumble without apparent cause, when circumstances that made no logical sense began to accumulate, when people left, when doors closed, when the drought began, because that moment may not have been the beginning of your defeat. It may have been the beginning of the process that will result in your Zakar. And there is a second scene in the entire Bible that describes the celestial court in an even more specific and directly relevant way to what you are living now. It is a scene from the book of the prophet Zechariah in chapter 3, and it is so precise in its correspondence with the situation of the viewer of this video that it seems to have been written for this moment. The prophet Zechariah has a vision, and in this vision he sees the high priest Joshua. Do not confuse him with the Joshua of the conquest of Canaan. This is another, with the Hebrew name Yeshua, but commonly called in Portuguese Josué, or Jesus the priest, standing before the angel of the Lord. And at his right hand stands the adversary, the accuser, ready to accuse him. Now look at what the text describes. Joshua was dressed in filthy garments. The high priest, the person who in Israel represented the entire people before God, was standing in the celestial court with dirty clothes. The accuser was right about the appearance. The clothes were dirty. There was no denying Joshua's visible state. But then the angel of the Lord said to the adversary, "The Lord rebuke you, Satan. Is not this man a burning stick snatched from the fire?" And then, addressing those standing before him, "Take off his filthy clothes." And he said to Joshua, "See, I have taken away your sin, and I will put fine garments on you." The verdict was not a denial of the accusation. The garments were dirty, that was true. The verdict was a decision that transcended the current state and declared a new identity regardless of the visible condition. Joshua left the court not because the accuser was wrong about the filthy garments. He left because the authority that pronounced the verdict was incomparably superior to the authority that had raised the accusation. You are not clean because you never made a mistake. You are clean because the one who has the authority to declare your definitive identity has already pronounced the verdict. And the verdict is not based on your performance. It is based on the covenant. The UFRJ published research in the area of psychoneuroimmunology that documented something scientists called the declared identity effect. When an individual internalizes a new identity deeply and consistently, the immune system itself responds in a measurable way. Stress biomarkers drop, cortisol production regularizes. The nervous system leaves the state of threat and enters a state of operation that researchers call expansion mode. In simple words, your body believes what you believe about who you are. And when you begin to operate from the identity of the verdict, and not the fear of the accusation, something physical and documentable begins to change. But here is the detail that almost everyone misses, and which is the difference between those who receive the transfer and those who continue waiting for it. Write the word verdict in the comments now, just that word. Because by writing verdict, you are making a positional declaration. You are saying that you are no longer awaiting judgment, that the judgment has happened, that you know the result, and that you are going to start living from that result now, not after the external manifestation appears. Write verdict. The process that Job went through was not just about restoring what he had before. It was about internal frequency refinement. This expression, internal frequency, is sometimes used in a way that sounds vague and groundless, but there is a scientific basis and a theological basis for it that are precise and that mutually confirm each other. The HeartMath Institute documented that the human heart emits an electromagnetic field that extends beyond the body and carries a pattern of information that corresponds to the individual's internal emotional and psychological state. This field has been measured and is not a metaphor. When the internal state is one of fear, scarcity, and the need for external validation, the electromagnetic pattern is incoherent, fragmented. When the internal state is one of peace, gratitude, and inner certainty, the pattern is coherent, ordered, and even influences the immediate environment around the person. Biblical theology calls this the heart, not the organ but the center of the personality. And the text of Proverbs says, "Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it." The verb to guard in this passage is in Hebrew, shamar. And shamar is not just passive protection. It is active vigilance. It is the work of the sentinel who examines everything that approaches before deciding if it can enter. Wealth is an amplifier. This is perhaps the most important financial principle that exists and the least taught in Sunday services and motivational channels. Wealth does not create character. Wealth reveals and amplifies the character that already exists. If the internal character is operating on the frequency of fear, the need for validation, the sense of scarcity that persists regardless of the balance, wealth will amplify the fear, will amplify the need for validation, will amplify the behavior of scarcity. And the result is a person who has more resources and more suffering at the same time, which is exactly the most common profile among people who receive unexpected inheritances or sudden gains without inner preparation. Research conducted by PUCRS on the financial behavior of Brazilians who received large unexpected amounts, whether through inheritance, business liquidation, or prizes, documented that within 5 years, more than 70% of these people had returned to a financial level identical to or lower than what they had before receiving it. The researchers identified that the determining factor was not technical financial education, nor access to investment advice. It was what they called the psychological set point of wealth, the internal frequency of who the person believes they are, which acts as a financial thermostat that always brings the level of external resources back to the level that the inner identity believes it deserves. The refinement process you went through was not just burning away behaviors. It was recalibrating the thermostat. It was replacing the identity of one who waits for crumbs with the identity of one who has been declared an heir by the highest court that exists. It was burning away the need for validation from people who have neither the map nor the compass to understand the territory where you were called to operate. There is a word in Hebrew that describes the state God was producing in you during this process. The word is chazak, and the most common translation is strong, courageous, firm. But chazak in Hebrew is not an abstract quality. It is a state of firmness that has been tested and proven real. It is the robustness of something that went through the process and came out without yielding. It is the solidity that only exists after pressure, not before it. When God says to Joshua, the leader now, at the entrance to Canaan, "Be strong and courageous. The verb is chazak. God is not saying pretend to be courageous. God is activating a quality that has already been formed in the process. That already exists. That needs to be recognized and mobilized, not created from scratch. Chazak is not an order to perform. It is a declaration of what you have already become without realizing it. You went through the process that formed the chazak in you. The drought you lived through was not destroying what you had. It was building what you needed to sustain what is on the way. And what is on the way cannot be sustained by the version of you that existed before the drought. It requires the chazak version, the version that came out of the oven and proved to be real. Activate the bell now, because in the next video on this channel, we are going to enter into something that is directly the continuation of what you are learning here. We are going to reveal why the people who most deserve the promotion are often the ones who most sabotage the moment of manifestation, and what is the specific spiritual and psychological mechanism that operates exactly when the transfer is closest. You will want to have the bell activated so you don't miss it. Now I need to give you the most practical and most urgent part of this video, because the verdict has been given, the chazak has been formed, the frequency has been recalibrated, and now there is a very concrete threat that most people do not identify as a threat, and that operates not by frontal attack, but by a much quieter and much more efficient mechanism. The danger now is not scarcity. The danger is the contamination of the frequency through the premature word. Let me explain what I mean by that. There is a principle in Proverbs that is frequently cited in a generic way, but has a specific and urgent application for those in the interval between the verdict and the manifestation. The text says, "Death and life are in the power of the tongue." It is not a poetic hyperbole. It is a description of a real mechanism of how the declared word affects the internal frequency of the speaker and the listener. When you share a dream before the right time with the wrong person, what happens is not just that the person may disagree or not believe. What happens is that you activate in your own internal system the need for external validation to sustain the belief in what was promised. And when the validation does not come, which is the case most of the time, because the people around you do not have access to the same level of revelation that you received, the dream begins to depend on the approval of others to exist. And any dream that needs the approval of others to survive is already operating on the wrong frequency. Research published in the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology by psychologist Peter Gollwitzer and his team revealed something that became one of the most cited findings of motivational psychology of the century. The study demonstrated that when people share their goals and intentions with others before achieving them, the brain experiences a sense of partial accomplishment as if the goal had already been met. This phenomenon, which researchers called symbolic completion, significantly reduces the motivation to continue pursuing the real goal. In other words, talking about what you are going to do partially satisfies the need that would drive you to actually do it. And this applies not only to psychological motivation, but to the spiritual frequency of those awaiting a manifestation that depends on the maintenance of an internal state. Every time you open the process to someone who does not have the capacity to hold it with you, you drain energy from the process. Not because the person is bad, but because the dream in the gestation stage has a vulnerability that the dream in the manifestation stage does not have. Think about how a baby's gestation works. In the first months, the pregnancy is guarded with great care, not because it is shameful, but because what is being gestated does not yet have the autonomy to exist outside the specific environment that was created for it. The 12-week-old baby cannot be exposed to the world without protection because the external world would be incompatible with the state of development it is in. Protection is not pathological secrecy. It is care for what is being formed. Your dream now is that baby, and here is the principle that will protect what is being gestated in you. It is what I call the rule of the 3 circles, and it is grounded both in biblical shamar and in the science of frequency maintenance. The first circle is the innermost and most sacred. It is composed exclusively of you and God. Everything that is being revealed to you about your next level, about the extent of what is on the way, about the details of the promise, about the dimensions of the calling stays in this circle. Not because you are ashamed of it, but because what God whispered to you in the silence was not designed for the volume of any human conversation. It was deposited in the innermost chamber of your intimacy with Him. And taking it out of there prematurely is like opening the chamber before the photographic process is complete. The image that should be sharp comes out blurred. The second circle is for a maximum of 3 people, and the word maximum is intentional and non-negotiable. These 3 people need to meet very specific criteria that have nothing to do with affection or relational proximity. The first is that they must have proven the ability to hold weight without buckling, which means you have already seen them go through pressure and maintain their position. The second is that they need to operate on a frequency of real faith and not well-intentioned skepticism, because the well-intentioned skepticism of those who love you is as destructive to the frequency of the dream as the open opposition of an enemy. The third is that they need to enter the process as prayer support and not as strategic advice, because what God is building does not need human analysis. It needs spiritual coverage. The third circle is for everyone else, and the rule here is absolute and without exception. You only share results, never process. You do not explain what is being gestated. You show the baby after it is born. The Central Bank of Brazil published analyses on the behavior of Brazilian micro and small entrepreneurs in business transition phases. One of the most consistent patterns identified was what analysts called social capital leakage, the habit of sharing early-stage projects with broad relationship networks before any concrete traction, which resulted in both internal demotivation and external interference that altered the original direction of the project before it had enough solidity to resist influences. Entrepreneurs who protected the process until the first proof of concept achieved significantly more consistent long-term results than those who operated with total transparency from the beginning. Jamar, guard your heart above all else that is to be guarded. But I need to go beyond the practical principle now and show you how this is rooted in something much deeper than strategy or psychology. When God prepared to do something completely new in the history of Israel, He rarely announced it in advance to the entire community. He spoke into the ear of one person. Noah did not go out into the streets to announce that the ark was being planned before any visible rain. Mary did not call an announcement meeting after the angel's visitation. David was anointed king in private in his father's house, without King Saul himself knowing. What was being gestated was too big and too vulnerable to exist in public space before it had been sufficiently formed. There is a principle in Hebrew that the rabbis call sod, the deepest level of interpretation of Scripture, the level of mystery and secret. And the rabbinic understanding of sod is that there are revelations that were given specifically to be carried in silence for a necessary period, not because they are shameful or doubtful, but because the environment of silence is part of the process of forming what was revealed. The prematurely exposed revelation loses the layer of development that silence was producing. You were anointed in silence. The court's decision happened in silence. The verdict was pronounced in silence. And the phase you are in now is the phase of productive silence, where what was decreed is gaining form, substance, and weight before becoming visible. And the adversary knows this. That is why his most common strategy in this phase is not a frontal attack on your faith. It is a very subtle temptation to make public what is being gestated in private. He places people around you who ask the right questions at the right time to awaken in you the impulse to explain, to justify, to prove that what you believe is real. And every time you yield to that impulse, you move energy from the gestation process to the defense process. An energy that is being used to defend itself is not being used to develop itself. The answer to this temptation is not defensiveness. It is not spiritual arrogance. It is not pathological isolation. It is simplicity. It is learning to say less than you know with a peace that most people will interpret as mystery, but which is just shamar, guarding, protecting, keeping in the inner chamber what was deposited in the inner chamber. And now I want to close with the dimension of all this that is more important than any practical principle. The verdict that was pronounced in your favor is not the result of your performance. It is not the accumulated sum of your good deeds, your hours of fasting, your early mornings in prayer. It is the consequence of a covenant that exists in an instance that is completely above your capacity to deserve or to lose. And that is exactly why it is unshakable. The accuser will still try. He will continue to use your external circumstances as an argument that the verdict was not real. He will use the delay as evidence that the promise was illusory. He will use the silence of the people around you as proof that you are alone. He will use every overdue bill, every closed door, every dream that has not yet manifested as a piece of renewed accusation. But you now know the mechanism. You know that the adversary's accusations have no jurisdiction over a verdict already pronounced in an instance superior to his. You know that the celestial court has already manifested, that the Zakar, God's active attention turned toward you, has already been activated, that the Chazak that was formed in you in the process is real and has been tested and proven solid, and that your only task now is Shamar, to guard the frequency, to protect what is being gestated, to remain in silence about the process and in peace about the result, because the result has already been declared. Share this video with someone who is going through sleepless nights without understanding what it is, who is interpreting the vigil as a sign of defeat when it could be the echo of a movement that happened in their favor in a sphere that eyes cannot reach. Because the most valuable gift you can give another person at this moment is not advice or money. It is the language they needed to read what they are living with the right eyes. And write verdict in the comments, because you know now. The judgment is not pending, the verdict has been proffered, the Zakar is active. And you are standing, not in the defendant's dock, but in the place where someone who has already been declared free has the right to be. Until the next video.